interesting.
Thank you.
Saul Landau is an author, commentator, and the celebrated filmmaker of over 40 films. He has received numerous awards, including an Emmy, the Letelier Moffat Human Rights Award, and the George Polk Award for Investigative Reporting. He spent time in Cuba and was present during terrorist attacks on that country. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Well, first, in watching your film, you spend the majority of the time in your film laying the background for the arrest of the Cuban Five rather than on the Cuban Five themselves as individuals. And I think that historical context is really important. Let's go back to the time of the Cuban Revolution, whose anniversary is today, and how it immediately began generating backlash here in the United States.
Well, yes, it did. The United States doesn't like disobedience, especially in its hemisphere. And the Cuban Revolution, from its inception, showed that it was not going to follow orders from Washington. And most people don't know this, but the United States government did all it could, really, to get Batista out early. It tried to foment a coup by a bunch of colonels and generals to replace Batista so that to head off the revolution, but failed to do so. So after the revolution won power, the United States then began to think about how they could curb the inclinations of this revolution, which showed immediate disrespect for U.S. property. And I think that was, if you ask, and this question is, of course, not asked in Washington when Cuba policy is mentioned, what did Cuba do to us? This was asked in 2006. I went to Cuba with Gore Vidal, and we were accompanied by former California Senate President John Burton. And during a dinner, which we were invited to, the U.S. interest section, which is like the embassy, but there's no formal relation, so it's called an interest section. And the diplomat, the U.S. diplomat, was asked by John Burton, he said, so what did Cuba do to us again? And the diplomat says, well, they violate human rights. And Burton says, yeah. But, like the Chinese killed thousands of Americans in Korea, and the Vietnamese killed thousands of Americans in Vietnam. They're both run by single-party communist governments. They don't have exactly shining human rights records. So what did Cuba do to us again? And the man really couldn't answer. But the answer, I think, is disobedience. I think if you look in the Guinness Book of Records, you'll find Fidel Castro there for disobedience.
Tell us about the Peter Pan campaign, the Pedro Pan campaign that you discuss in your film, and how and this sort of relates to the kinds of modern anti-Castro attacks we're seeing. What was this campaign, and what happened to these people that were involved in the campaign?
Well, the Peter Pan operation was a joint venture, so to speak, between the Catholic Church hierarchy and the Central Intelligence Agency. And the design was essentially to have a brain drain, to take the best and brightest of the middle class and upper middle class kids who were in private schools.
And children. That's why Peter Pan.
Yes, they were kids. And they were whisked away with phony visas and phony excuses, almost 15,000 of them over a period of 3 years, and taken to the United States, where they were put in foster homes. Some of them turned out happily, and some of them did not. In the film, we have two examples of Sylvia Wilhelm, who was very angry at her mother for making the decision, and Nelson Valdez, who essentially became an orphan and was sent to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he grew up and working very hard. I mean, he turned out very well, but a lot of the Peter Pan kids did get good families, and some didn't. But the idea of kidnapping, essentially, almost 15,000 kids, was one of the tactics that was used among many. In the film, it's very interesting because now everybody's talking about Norway. But if you add up the number of bombings carried out by Cuban exiles, anti-Castro exiles, in this country, you have hundreds of bombings over the course of the years.
Sure.
And the death of many, many people. But nobody discusses them when we talk about terrorism. Their names are not Mohammed, it's stuff like that.
Well, I want to play an excerpt from your documentary, Will the Real Terrorists Stand Up, about, just going back to some of the earliest attempts, particularly targeting Castro, President Kennedy, and the early attempts to assassinate Castro.
There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan.
The immediate mood in the White House in the weeks that followed the Bay of Pigs was a mixture of anger, frustration. There's little doubt then that our ultimate objective remained the same, which was the overthrow of the Cuban Revolution or the Castro regime.
Dick Bissell's secretary called me and said, "Come on in, he wants to talk to you." And the first thing he said to me, "Cuba is going to be reactivated." The president had me in his office with his brother, and they both attacked me for having sat on my ass since the Bay of Pigs and not done anything to, quote, get rid of Castro and the Castro regime, unquote. Those were the orders. My first question to him was, what does get rid of mean? His answer to me was very simple: use your imagination.
We were told to dispose of Mr. Castro, and to the word dispose you can add anything you want.
That's a clip from the documentary Will the Real Terrorist Please Stand Up by my guest, Saul Landau, who joins me in studio and is going to be presenting the film tonight at 7 p.m. at the Lumley's Monica Fourplex, 1332 2nd Street in Santa Monica. That's at 7 p.m. and we will announce this information one more time as well. He's going to be available for a Q&A session. So in this clip that we just heard, it so clearly, it's very openly documented the attempts to assassinate Castro, and it also referenced the Bay of Pigs invasion. You were in Cuba in 1961, right before the Bay of Pigs invasion?
Yes, I was.
And so let's talk about these, how this sort of sets the stage for what came to be the arrest of the Cuban Five. There's a long history in the United States, an open government policy, at least back then, to assassinate Castro.
Well, yes. Everybody accepts now the figure of 638 assassination attempts, many of them backed by the CIA. The fact that Fidel is still alive is sort of a miracle, or else he's extremely lucky. Now, this policy is bizarre in the sense that when the United States wasn't actually sponsoring the terrorist acts against Cuba, it was looking the other way and allowing the Cuban exiles to carry them out. So either they were directly partnered with the CIA or encouraged informally, passively, if you like, by the U.S. authorities. There's a scene in the film where we found in the archives a quote from Eisenhower when he is told by the Secretary of State at the time, Christian Herter, this is back in 1959, that Cuban exiles are using Florida sites to take off and bomb Cuba, and the Cubans are complaining. And Eisenhower's response is, well, why don't the Cubans just shoot the planes down? And in fact, this sort of leads directly to the arrest then of these Cuban Five that Castro sent to the United States. Let's discuss a little bit more about these flights over Cuba. They originated from the anti-Castro Cuban community in Miami, and what was their goal? Well, it wasn't the anti-Castro Cuban community, because there are many Cuban communities. It was the goal of Brothers to the Rescue. At first was supposedly they were going to spot rafters at sea. After the Soviet Union went away, the Cuban economy took a terrible nosedive, and a lot of people started leaving. There was no work, food was hard to get, and people in makeshift rafts and little floating boats tried to cross the 90 miles of water to hit Florida. Some of them died, some of them were in peril, and so this group began to fly over them and radio the positions of these rafters to nearby ships so they would be rescued. Then the United States and Cuba signed a migration accord because the United States had enough Cuban migrants. And Brothers to the Rescue had no more funding. So they changed their mission. And the new mission was fly over Cuba, drop leaflets over Havana. The Cubans said...
And this is a violation of Cuban airspace.
Of course. It's a total violation. And the Cubans began to complain. They complained. In the film we have former Governor Bill Richardson, who at the time was a member of Congress from New Mexico, he was given a direct request by Fidel Castro, who also appears in the film at age 84, to tell President Clinton to stop this, that this is not tolerable, that no country can allow its capital city to be overflown by invading aircraft. You don't know what they're going to do.
And so eventually the U.S. was sent a letter that detailed some of the information that Cuba thought the U.S. would act on in good faith. The U.S. turned around and arrested the man who collected the information, who came to be known as the Cuban Five.
Yes, in a sense, the FBI was one of the Cuban Five thinks Gerardo Hernandez, who's the one closest to Los Angeles. He's in Victorville in the maximum security federal penitentiary. He thinks that the FBI got burned because one of the Brothers to the Rescue pilots was an FBI informer, Juan Pablo Roque. This man was also a Cuban spy. So he was a double agent. Gerardo Hernandez helped Roque get back to Cuba just before the fatal flights of February 1996.
Which Cuba shot down.
Yes, when Cuba shot down 2 of the 3 Brothers to the Rescue planes. Roque, at his press conference, declared that Brothers to the Rescue was planning armed aggression, that they were going to now fire weapons in their next overflight, and that these people were really dangerous. The FBI was accused then by right-wing Miami radio and the right-wing exile press of having been taken over by Fidel Castro. The communists now control the Justice Department, said the radio commentators, and so on. So in a sense, the FBI, having been attacked like this, covered itself by arresting the very people that were giving them the information on terrorism.
And these are men who are facing some of the multiple life sentences. What is the fate currently of the Cuban Five, who have been the focus of a lot of activism, social justice activism in the United States, but still are sort of not very well known in among the mainstream?
Well, for the lawyers that I've spoken to, including very conservative lawyers, the idea of having tried them in Miami was ridiculous. That is, it would be the equivalent of trying a Jew in Berlin in 1939. That would be their chances of getting a fair trial. So they didn't get a fair trial. And they got hideously long sentences. My own feeling is that both the jury and the judge were intimidated. I think most people have watched episodes of The Sopranos, and they know how that's done. When the jury's license plates are all photographed and the jury is identified, they know darn well they better not deliver an acquittal verdict on this.
And so is there any appeals process? Is there a change of heart under the Obama administration to pardon them or anything to the like?
Well, the Obama administration has given no indication that it is planning to pardon them or even exchange them for an American prisoner held in Cuba named Alan Gross. There is an appeal that's being filed. It will be filed before August 15th, a habeas writ saying that this shouldn't have been a trial at all because the planes were shot down over Cuban airspace, which would mean no crime took place because the Cubans had every right to shoot them down, as Eisenhower indicated, way back in 1959.
Well, Saul Landau, I definitely encourage listeners to come and watch your entire film. It's a very comprehensive history of U.S. intimidation of Cuba, U.S.-Cuban relations, leading up to the Cuban Five today. And again, you're going to be at the Lumley Monica Fourplex tonight at 7 p.m. from 7 to 10 p.m. Haskell Wexler, who was a DP on the film, is also going to be there. It's at the Lumley Monica Fourplex, 1332 2nd Street in Santa Monica. And there'll be a Q&A as well. The name of the film is Will the Real Terrorist Please Stand Up? Thank you so much, Saul.
And the DVD will be released as well.
So people can get DVD copies at the screening.
Yes, they can.
Wonderful.
From Cinema Libre Studio. That's the distributor.
Thank you so much, Cinema Libre. Good friends of ours. Thanks so much, Saul, for joining us.
Thank you, Sonali.